Hello to everybody. My name is George Cable. I'm the marketing executive here at Adatus, and I'm really excited to be kicking off this afternoon with episode 1 in our 2-part Power BI series, looking specifically at strategy and driving business change within organizations. We are joined by our principal Power BI consultant, Matt Gordon, who has many years of experience with Power BI solutions. I will let Matt do his introduction very shortly, but from my side, just some housekeeping. So next slide, please, Matt. Yeah, so this webinar will be recorded purely for the purpose of on demand for anyone that can't join the webinar or those that would like to watch the webinar again after we go live today. You might be aware that everyone's mic and camera is muted. This is purely because we want to have no disturbances throughout the webinar. However, at the end, we will be unmuting the mic if you would like to ask Matt any personal questions. But please feel free to use the Q&A chat function for any questions that you have throughout the entire webinar, and we will get back to them at the end when we host a Q&A session. So without further ado, I'd love to pass over to Matt Gordon for episode 1. Thanks, Matt.
Hey, everyone. As George said, I'm Matt Gordon. I'm a consultant at Adatus, but in a previous role, I led the rollout of Power BI at King's College London. I was involved from being patient zero, the early adopter, the disruptor, saying this is we should be using this new tool, to building out proof of concept reports, developing training, migrating from pro to premium, right through to being the tenant administrator at the end of the day, who was then stressed about what all of the other disruptors and people were doing at King's College London with Power BI. So I went on a full journey with it there. These days, I work at Adatus, and for those that aren't familiar with Adatus, we are a consultancy, which I suppose two things sum us up really. One, we do data. We do all aspects of data, from data governance and strategy, through data warehousing, data science, all the way through to data visualization and communication at the end of the process. And the second, I suppose, component about Adatus is we do that with the Microsoft stack. That's the sort of set of technologies we work with exclusively. And while at Adatus, I try and help people get value out of Power BI. And the thing I'm particularly interested in, I suppose, is what I call data's final mile, which, just as with any sort of logistics operation or delivery thing, it's the bit that puts it in the hands of the customer that most determines satisfaction. And the same is true with data, really. Just as with, if you order a parcel and the delivery is sort of thrown at your steps, and then the person runs off and leaves it there without pressing the button, without letting you know about it, your satisfaction will not be good. I think with data as well, for decision makers and the people who often fund the projects, it's that final bit, the final bit that gives them access to that data that determines their satisfaction. Because often they're not interested in the technical stuff that goes before that. They're interested in having access to the data to make decisions. And I think that's incredibly important, but it's an incredibly challenging environment. You don't have to look very far in regard to data related projects to see lots of them that are not deemed as successful by the people who fund them, by the people who ultimately use them. A quick Google or Bing or your search engine of preference will turn out lots of examples going through the history of data over the last 20 or 30 years, and data related buzzwords saying why those projects, or saying that a large portion of projects have not been successful. And while that's true of a whole range of different data projects, it's equally true of Power BI, and a risk with rolling out Power BI, implementing Power BI. I was struck recently by a tweet from a Microsoft MVP called Melissa Coates, who's written quite extensively around Power BI adoption and was doing a pre-con at the recent PASS Summit. And as part of that, they ran a survey of the attendees at the summit and what they were feeling about their sort of organizational data culture generally and in relation to Power BI. And while lots of them felt it was growing, if you look at the set of tweets, they identify a lot of very real challenges around data silos, around governance, around adoption, and risks that therefore for an organization that implementing Power BI but are not getting value out of it, it's not delivering what they want into the organization, they're not solving their problems. And really, I think that's what today is about. It's about looking about how you not just deploy Power BI, which is incredibly easy to deploy into an organization, you know, click a few buttons on the tenancy and everyone gets Power BI. But how do you deliver it in a way which delivers value into an organization, which meets the organization's needs around data? And so what I'm going to try and cover off in this session is really three things that I think that relate to that really. The first is perhaps what the difference between a strategy and a roadmap is. We've used both in the title, and I think there is a distinction between the two. And then how you go about developing a strategy, and then how you go about creating a roadmap around that strategy, and perhaps some of the key themes that you might want to consider. And I think the first thing really is, what do I mean by a strategy and why is that different to a roadmap? And I think a strategy really needs to set out what you want to achieve and why you want to achieve it. And then the roadmap is about how you then go and implement that strategy. And I suppose when you think about the strategy, it might be with Power BI that you want to empower better decisions in your organization or business to increase revenue. It might be that you want to remove a legacy tool in order to reduce costs. There might be a number of reasons that you want to use Power BI and why you want to deploy it and the benefits you're seeking to gain from doing it. But the strategy should set that out at a high level. It should be not the detail, but the reasons you want to do something. And then the roadmap element of that, or the implementation document, or call it what you want, really then needs to sort of break that down into the detail, talk about how you're going to go about achieving the goals you've set, how you're going to go about realizing the benefits you've identified. It needs to break it down into various components. It needs to set some timescales around it and really look at the process of implementing the strategy. I think also when we talk about both those documents, they are living things and they change. If we've learned anything over the last few years, it's that the outside world can change quite quickly, and that has very real impacts on the way organizations and businesses operate and organize, and it continues to change in lots of ways. So whatever your strategy and roadmaps are, they're not fixed. They are living things that will change over time. So how do you go about developing a strategy? What's the sort of process that I go through when thinking about building out a strategy? For me, I think there are two key components I want to cover off in terms of it. The first is really thinking about where your strategy sits for your business or organization, and where your Power BI strategy sits in relation to two other, I think, strategies that should exist within your business, really. The first is, what's the overall business strategy? What's the goals for the organization? What are you trying as an organization to achieve, whether that's increasing revenue, increasing margin, reducing costs, expanding your footprint, you have to think about how Power BI is going to help with that strategy. If Power BI isn't visibly helping to move your business along with its organizational goals and what it's trying to achieve, then there's an issue with your Power BI strategy. You have to very much situate it and focus it on helping to achieve those goals. And sometimes that means picking out, making sure the focus of that strategy, is reflected in the Power BI content that's being produced, but it has to be visibly seen to help achieve that. The second component of that is it has to fit within your organizational data strategy. And if you've not got an organizational data strategy, in some ways, the first step is to, and it's a completely different webinar, but I would say the first step is perhaps to sit back and think about that before going on to talk about the Power BI strategy. Data strategies are often framed or can be framed as either offensive or defensive strategies, that they have a focus on perhaps compliance and defending your data, making sure it's secure, making sure you meet any obligations you have from external bodies, or perhaps more offensive, very much focused on extracting value out of that, out of the data you have. And sometimes you can see that, organizations with high compliance burdens or working with very sensitive personal data will tend to have a data strategy that is much more focused on ensuring that they adhere to that compliance, that their data is secure, that there are no risks of breaches. Whereas others are much more focused on seizing the commercial opportunities that their data presents, reducing customer churn, for example, by identifying factors that lead to customers staying with an organization. And the overall data strategy for your organization is going to have impacts on your Power BI, or should have help frame your Power BI strategy as well. Because if you have a data strategy which is very focused on compliance and defense, then that needs to be reflected in your Power BI strategy. Otherwise, Power BI becomes this sort of area which is actually actively working against certain components of your data strategy. So I think whenever framing your Power BI strategy, I think the first thing to do is to situate it within the context of your business strategy and the business goals, and within the wider data strategy for the organization. The second area that I think that needs to be factored into the strategy is really assessing where you are now and where you and thinking about that, where you are now in relation to what you want to achieve. What your maturity with Power BI is, what your experience is, what the current situation is. Where are you now? Is it a blank slate? Are you about to press the button and deploy Power BI for the first time? Or do you have a Power BI implementation that you're looking to get more value out of? Or are there specific issues that you're trying to identify and take on in relation to Power BI? And there's all sorts of ways of characterizing your current level of maturity. The one on screen is the one that Microsoft supply for Power BI, that's available in their roadmap documents, where they sort of have a maturity curve which takes it from sort of initial, I think, where they would describe it as a few early adopters using Power BI in the organization, right through to what they describe as efficient, where Power BI is the default tool which large numbers of users within the organization are using for decision making, and is really ubiquitous within the organization as a tool for decision making. And having a sort of an assessment of where you are now, what your current situation is, allows you then to frame where you're starting and where you want to, and then link that to where you want to get to. And, with any strategy, you have to, you might choose to break it down. You might choose to do it in various steps and say, right, we're at this point. Our next goal is to get us to the next stage in the maturity curve. And you're going to hopefully build out and articulate a strategy which explains what you want to do. And of course, all organizations are different. You're going to have to locate it in the particular culture and context of your organizations. And while I'm on the point of strategy, I don't think strategies need to be huge, complicated. You need to focus it down to the sort of high level, what you want to achieve and why you want to achieve it. And in some ways, it benefits from being something that you can easily articulate and explain to a large number of users in their organization, whether they understand the technical details of Power BI and all of the different settings. Really, you're trying to explain what you want to achieve to them in a way they understand. At King's, when we were talking about what we were trying to do with Power BI, we essentially had 2 slides that we used nearly all of the time to explain it. The first one was this one, where we talked about, I think, the Hippo culture that we had as an organization. And the Hippo, for anyone who's not heard of it before, is the idea that in the absence of data in an organization or a meeting or a decision point, that decisions are taken on the basis of on the basis of the highest paid person's opinion. So whoever happens to be the most important person in the room, and therefore usually the highest paid person, that's the basis on which decisions tend to be made in the absence of countervailing data. And when we were articulating it, we would say to people, look, we have a lot of data, but we're not using it to make decisions. We need to get to the point where we're using data to drive our decisions, so we make better decisions that drive the organization towards its goals. Now, we also had a slightly more formal version of this, which we used particularly in meetings when we were talking to some of the highest paid people. And this has been seen in various other presentations, but it was just a sort of BI maturity curve. It was a bit more formal. It articulated the fact that at the point we started, King's was very dependent on Excel, had Excel silos all over the organization, but we were trying to move to a point where the work was repeatable, was pervasive, where we were using data to make strategic decisions to affect the organization. And this is the very early version of it. But actually, King's, when I was there and since then, has continued to move along this curve and has continued to move up its strategic goals towards data being used across the organization. And so really, for me, that's what the strategy should be. It should be something that you can simply summarize, setting out what you want to achieve and the benefits you're hoping that's going to deliver into the organization. The next part is obviously the roadmap. And the roadmap is about breaking your strategy down into the detail. It's about looking at the various components that will form that will help you deliver that strategy, setting some targets, some goals, developing a timeline for implementing it and moving you towards achieving your strategy. There's going to be a lot of different areas that you'll need to think about. I'm going to cover off a few of them in a minute, but it's going to be in no means exhaustive list of different areas that will need to make up your roadmap. But this is where you need to get down into the detail. And some of this, you'll talk a lot about users, and some of it, like tenant and admin settings, probably may not always be that visible to them. But it needs to be there so that the people who are engaged in trying to deliver your Power BI strategy know what they're trying to get, know how they're going to get to their end goals. So the first area I want to pick off, really, and I think is one of the most important in terms of delivering Power BI into an organization, is sponsorship. Having a good sponsor for what you're trying to do with Power BI is incredibly important. Obviously, the sponsor will be the person who's going to tend to fund the work you're doing, pay for it. They're going to be the person who can help solve your problems if you end up in issues which require a senior stakeholder to intervene. But when I talk about a sponsor, I think you're looking for slightly more than that if you can get it. What you're looking for also is someone who's going to role model using Power BI. Because if you have someone senior in your organization who is sitting there in meetings using Power BI reports, who, when they talk to their direct reports, is saying, I saw in Power BI this fact, this bit of data, what are we doing about it? That can make an incredible difference. It's amazing how quickly senior people's direct reports suddenly start looking at Power BI when they realize that their manager, their leader is referring to it. So if you can find a sponsor who is not just gonna pay for it, but who's actively gonna lead and champion it by example more than anything else, that will make your entire roadmap, implementing your entire roadmap, much easier. A second area I want to flag up about the roadmap that you will have to begin to think about is broadly ownership and management of the content within Power BI. And I suppose over the history of analytics, there's a sort of, it goes in sort of waves and swings from one direction to another. Sometimes it's described as decentralized versus centralized. Sometimes the emphasis is on self-service versus enterprise, business-led versus IT. There's a lot of different ways of conceiving it and modeling the way you're going to organize your Power BI estate. And they all have different pros and cons, but you need to have a think about which one works for your organization. And I'm not saying there's a right one, because I don't think there is. It varies for organizations, and it varies for where organizations are at different points in their data life cycle and their data culture. But you need to think about whether you're going to focus on creating it centrally, whether you're going to really just empower the business users to lead it themselves and various people within the organization to lead it themselves, or whether you're going to try and find that hybrid between the sort of perhaps two models. And it's getting this right and being able to explain it, to articulate, to get buy-in in it is incredibly helpful in delivering out the benefits of Power BI to the organization. A third area that I think you need to think about and spend a bit of time on is people. And I know this is sort of obvious, but most things relate to people ultimately. But various people in your organization are going to be your champions. They're going to be your developers. They're going to be the people building Power BI content and using Power BI content. And you need to support them in that. You need to think about whether people have the skills to build the data models. If they don't, how are we going to give them those skills? They have the skills to visualize the data and communicate it effectively to the consumers. Do the consumers need to know how to use Power BI? Do they understand, how to interface with it? Things that people who use it like me all the time forget, that right-clicking on this will allow you to drill through, and all of these things. How do you support them in it? How do you build a community of practice to support all of your users, to develop them, and to help them get the most out of Power BI? It's also about people, because Power BI is also a change. Implementing any transformation is also a change project. And, with Power BI particularly, and often with beginning to roll out Power BI, it can be a significant change project. Even if you're migrating away from using Excel, there will be the people in various business units who are the Excel gurus, who are the expert, who people come to and says, can you tell me what the answer to this question is? Their role, their job is dependent on Excel. So you need to think about how you deliver that change, how you get them involved, how you make them a champion and a promoter for Power BI within the organization, and not someone who's seeing it as a threat, someone who sees it as a problem. And some of that is just very standard sort of change management. It's about making sure you work with all of the people involved. And it can be really challenging. I know, after we began to roll out Power BI, the most initial frustrating response we used to get Kings was because people were very used to receiving PDFs of reports, was, can I have this as a PDF, please? And various analysts, including myself, had spent ages building these beautiful interactive reports, and we just get asked for PDFs. But you'd have to go back to them, show them the benefits of having the interactivity of the data, talk them through it, work through with them, make sure they had some buy-in in shaping the format of the reports, even if that was just around the font and the color, but trying to get them involved in it. The other thing was communications, making sure everyone knew what we were doing with Power BI, the benefits it was delivering. And this is where picking some good flagship reports, some things where you really want to show the benefit and the value it's delivering in the organization is incredibly important. I cannot, having those reports which suddenly, which pick off a problem that people have seen for years in the organization, or that suddenly shed light on an area of data where it didn't exist before, or suddenly help make decisions that deliver with key elements of the business strategy is incredibly important. And then talking about that and talking about the values it's delivered previously in the organization can be incredibly important. Communicating out the successes, the benefits, what it's delivered. And they're just a few of the key elements you need to think about in shaping your roadmap. There's a huge number of others, which I don't have time really to go through in detail today, but obviously you've got to think about the data governance. You've got to think about data quality. Are you dealing with the data quality issues in Power BI, or are you exposing the bad data that might exist in your organization? Think about the technology stack, both in terms of Power BI. Are you using premium or pro, or premium per user? But also, where does it fit with your wider data infrastructure? Are you using Synapse? Are you thinking about using Synapse in the future? You need to think about the technology that you're going to use. Creating a center of excellence, and I'm deliberately not talking about a center of excellence very much, because my colleague Laz is doing that in the next webinar, but incredibly important, having a center of excellence to drive your Power BI strategy in the organization. Monitoring, reporting on what you're doing, who's doing what within the Power BI tenancy. Access and security, who can access what, how is the data secured? Does that meet the standards of your internal security teams? Administration, who are your tenant administrators? What happens when Microsoft introduce new functionality, which they do frequently? How do you make a decision on that? Who makes a decision, and how is that communicated to the users? There's a whole range of different things that need to be considered in detail, and I haven't got time to go through it all now. I know we work with a number of our clients building these roadmaps, and I think we have a 4-stage process really around it when we sit down with them. We take it from an initial plan where we sort of work out what they want, what the client wants from the engagement, both in terms of the level of detail, but also in terms of where it sits within their data strategy and their wider business goals and what they're looking to achieve. We then undertake a sort of current state assessment, which is what I've talked about, and that again can be, relatively high level or incredibly detailed, right down to the data assets that the organization holds. And then we really try and sit down and look at where they want to get to with it, and map out a roadmap to try and achieve it, and try and work out how it can be done in an actionable way, a series of steps that allow the organization to move from where it is now to where it wants to get to with Power BI. And, it's something that's been very effective, but it is, in some ways, I will say this, writing out the strategy and roadmap is perhaps the easier bit of the process. I think there's a very famous quote from Peter Drucker, who was a sort of academic and management consultant in the States, and he said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," and it is very true. I think one of the biggest challenges with delivering Power BI, delivering it successfully into an organization is a change project. And change is all about organizational culture. It's not about just the technology. It's about changing the way people work with data, use data, and how they make their decisions. And that is a change project. It's a culture project, and therefore requires as much effort on that area as it does on the Power BI as a technology piece. And for me, that's where I really want to conclude. Really, hopefully, this has been useful in terms of talking through for me what the difference between a strategy and a roadmap is. Strategy as the high level, what you want to achieve and why, and the roadmap as the detailed breakdown of how you want to get there and the various areas you need to consider. Hopefully I've covered off a few of them, but I'm aware I've not had time to do them all. So really, at this point, I want to sort of hand it over really to you for any questions. If anyone has anything they'd like me to go over again or talk in more detail, please do put it in chat, or I think George, raise your hand and I think George will unmute you.
Yeah, that's great. So you should be able to unmute yourself if you would like to ask Matt a question via the mic. If not, feel free to use the chat function. There may not be any questions for you, Matt. You might have concluded. Okay, so we got some from Amrit.
Hiya, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for this. Means all this demo, it's really good actually. All the presentation means it's really helpful. I have a question of that part when you shared means the steps to prepare the strategy. So the approach is basically first step is a plan, second is a step is current state assessment. So for that second step, I was just looking at what is the means what kind of process you suggest to how we to assess the current state of the data across organization, because like in organization we have means various teams, various systems across. So what approach we can take to get that current state?
So when we do it,
yeah,
it partly will vary on the level of detail that the client wants to go into. But at the highest level, I suppose we're looking at, well, firstly, is Power BI implemented at all? If not, what tools are you currently using? What's the level of maturity with those tools? Is the requirement to migrate from where you are now as an organization, or is it a completely is it trying to transform the way you're using Power BI? We then have a sort of wider dig around into your sort of data architecture, i.e. what are your data sources like? What's the data governance around that like? What's the existing data strategy? And the governance model, who are the key stakeholders, some stakeholder mapping, what are the key priorities around Power BI? But in some cases, it goes into, quite detailed, it can, not always, but can go into quite detailed analysis where people ask us to come and look at all of the different data sets they have, where they haven't, at the minute, where Power BI is being deployed and no one really in the organization understands what's going on. So it's like, what data assets do we have? Who's doing what with Power BI? What reports do we have? What data items are in them? What data models do we have? What's the performance of those data models? What's the risk profile around it? So it can really vary. But I guess if you think back to some of the other things in the areas I was talking about in terms of training, change, operating models, governance, you can break that down and look at the current state for all of those things. And that's probably the way I would approach it.
Okay. So another thing is that if means we worked on that, we defined that, and then as part of defining the future state assessment means how we define that, what kind of not how, probably means I'm trying to rephrase my question actually. Means basically how we try to find out the the best possible tools which suits our so future means state actually. So like with the Power BI, obviously we are looking for the Power BI, but if we think that we need to get that transform data, whether we need to go for Snowflake or Synapse to get and work on the data before using the Power BI, something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's some good starting points for that in terms of beginning to think about what you want to achieve. But always start with what does the business want to achieve is the first thing I would say.
Yeah.
The second bit is as you begin to think about the technology stack, some of that will be defined in the data strategy. So think about if that's defined in your data strategy, and if it's not, I would almost say probably the first step is to take a step backwards and say, right, what is our data strategy? And we help, we do quite a lot of data strategies for people, but that should be perhaps framing the wider technological stack you're going to use as part of Power BI. In relation to Power BI, just in terms of some specifics, I suppose there's some quite good stuff there for you already. I think Power BI is loves a star schema more than a snowflake schema. I think that's fairly well documented. But also, I think there's Matthew Roche, who's one of the customer advisory team for Power BI. I think coined a phrase that transform your data as far upstream as possible and as far downstream as necessary. So of course, and I suppose it's a truism of working with data. If you can prevent the bad data arriving in your pipeline at the beginning through validation, that's more, that's obviously the best place to do it. If you need to clean it in a stage in your process, it's probably done earlier so it can be reused multiple times. So I think there's a lot of different ways of doing it, I think, and a lot of different ways of framing it. I think there was a question from Eric, was it, around
so what challenges do you face with training and skills when rolling out Power BI?
I think this can be a very big one, and I think it applies right from the people who are building the data sets right through to the people who are consuming data. And I think with perhaps the more technical roles, Power BI obviously has a preferred architecture. It works better with certain architecture, and often one of the challenges you face is as an organization, you might have an existing set of tools, whether that's Excel or Tableau or something else, and they all prefer data to be modeled in a certain way and created in a certain way. And so sometimes you're having to unpick that. And I'd say one of the biggest things with Power BI and the data modeling bit of it is getting that right, because everything performs better when your data model is good. And particularly as you scale it up as an enterprise, you can get away with, if you've got a few 100,000 rows in a report, you can have a bad data model. If you have a few 100 million, then you need to sort of think about how you optimize it. The same is true with data visualization and what you put on the page. If as an organization you come and people are used to producing large tables in PDF formats or whatever, that will go, people can put that onto Power BI pages. And so I think there's some very real challenges. I think there's some great content out there for training though. So I think that's really good, but it is something you do need to hopefully think about, and hopefully this is beginning to answer a little bit about it. But I would identify some good data modeling training, some good sort of data visualization and communication training for the people who are building the artifacts, and begin to push it out not just to a core group but to a wider group, so people have a common framework and common understanding. I think the other thing is don't neglect training for the people who are going to use the reports. And I mean that training both in terms of the technical, how to use Power BI, because it's easy to assume it's just clicking on a screen, but actually a lot of people aren't used to it. A lot of people, it's not their experience of consuming data. And so that can definitely help a lot. I think the other area I think about, and this varies by organization, but is and it's not a term I like, but I suppose data literacy sums it up perhaps. It's not very, I don't like it as a term because it just sort of infers people are somehow illiterate, which is never a good thing to describe people as. But it's easy to assume that everyone knows how to read a chart, but that isn't always the case. You know, that I spend all my time in data, so I know that, you know, you see a chart, you read the title, you read the axes, you look at the, you know, you look at the scale of the chart, the values that are being represented. Is it over, you know, is it time, is it categorical? But you might need to think about how you also tackle those if they're challenges you have. What's the next question we've got here?
So we have, what's your recommended approach for measuring adoption for Power BI, i.e. in terms of measuring usage, customer satisfaction, business value gained when moving to Power BI? That's from Michael Husband.
No, I think that's a great question, actually, because I think one of the things that often gets left out is measuring the benefits and adoptions, and, you know, reports are thrown out into the wilderness and no one ever looks at whether anyone's actually using the report. And I'd be honest, it's a combination of all of those, I would say. I think really the gold standard is if you can identify business value, if you can point to some money that has been generated or saved on the basis of a decision that was made as a result of Power BI being used. It's clearly the gold standard. I know at King's, one of the ways we promoted Power BI was we used to organise lots of hackathons where we would get all sorts of people to come together with their business problems and their Excel spreadsheets, and we try and get them into Power BI in a day to deliver some value. And one of the first ones we tackled was around was one brought to us by our sustainability team, where they brought along loads of different data they had on waste recycling, and most of the day was spent really just trying to wrangle PDFs and Excel spreadsheets into a coherent thing where we could look at the state of waste over the course of the day. But the one thing it clearly demonstrated to them, and that they could then demonstrate to their clearest stakeholders, is we had like 17 separate waste collection suppliers, and our first big problem was we had too many suppliers, and that we needed to consolidate that into a single contract. And the very fact they could demonstrate that on screen led to that happening, and led to, you know, an annual saving of £100,000 on the contract. So very clear proof of benefit there. I think customer satisfaction is important. Measuring usage is important. I think it is always worth looking at, but you have to be slightly careful with usage. You know, if you've got one person using it, it might look bad, but if that one person is your CFO and they're looking on it every day, it's not a bad report. It's probably doing its job. But yeah, value, decisions that are being made. I think it's asking people, and I think the most important thing is if you find reports that are not being used or not being utilized, is not to sort of treat that as an affront, but to go back to the people who'd originally asked for it and said, right, what's the problem with this? No one's looking at it. Why? What have we got wrong? What aren't we doing that you need us to do? What bit of information is not here that you need? Hopefully that helps. Feel free to ask again and argue with me if I'm not answering your questions, by the way. So tips on communication. I suppose my main thing is don't leave it as an afterthought. You know, if you have communications, because, you know, the reality is if you have a data team, communications is probably not going to be always their speciality. And even if they have some skills in it, spending time putting together internal websites, writing emails, managing communications, organizing events to promote Power BI, it's not necessarily going to be the thing that's going to be part of their job or seem to deliver value. But I think you need to commit some resource. Now, if you're lucky, you'll have some budget for someone to do communications for you. That's the sort of gold bit, or you'll have an internal communications function that you can borrow some resource from. But I think that the key part is broadly at the high level, you want to be communicating the strategy, what you're trying to achieve and what benefits you're trying to deliver via it, and hopefully be showing people those benefits being delivered in action. You know, this report's been built, these are the decisions people are making, this is the value we're doing. But then I think as you start to break it down into the roadmap, you're also going to be talking about what you're trying to achieve next in that roadmap, why you're trying to achieve it, and the highlights of it. So, you know, we've now delivered reporting in this new area. Power BI has been taken up in this team. This is what they've produced. This is what they've used it for. Here's a stakeholder who's benefited from it. You know, giving us why they think it's a benefit. And it's hard to say what works well in an organization and what you can skip, because in my experience it varies, but you'll have a better idea than I will how people respond, and whether whether your organization is all about email or meetings or Teams or, you know, webinars or whatever it is. But try different things. Don't get wedded to it. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't work, I'd say try something else. Be a bit flexible on it, but keep trying to communicate out what you're doing and promote it. Hopefully that helps, Eric. Julie, have you any tips on how to get Power BI users who can build reports to adhere to standards, data sharing principles, testing of critical assets? Yeah, I think this can be a challenge, and I think there's a lot of different options you can do. I think partly it's about training, and it's about trying to just embed a common approach and culture into the organization, and particularly have some champions in the different areas and the users, so that they can also hopefully work with it and understand that common framework you're trying to do it, and why you're doing it. And often you find that, you know, people who've built something build it and with the best intentions and with the best that their skill allows them to deliver. They haven't, you know, generally done it they've done it because that's what they could do and that's how they could get it out there. And so sometimes it's being prepared to commit some time to supporting the person to become a better, you know, to change the person in that sense, so they become a better person at building out those reports. Depending on how critical it is for your organization, sometimes the big stick might need to come out, and that's something that, you know, should sit within that wider data governance framework a little bit, that, you know, there should be these, you know, standards around it. I'd also say it's really helpful in making a distinction between the sort of the enterprise sort of level reports, the ones that need to be there, need to work, and need to be there consistent every day, and perhaps the more localized reports that people are building in their own area, and, you know, making sure that, you know, that people understand. And obviously this changes, because things that begin as tiny little local reports sometimes become business critical reports, but making sure people understand that for the critical reports, the consequence of it not being, you know, someone deploying a change and it breaking the report, you know, it can be actually have major implications for the business, and that's the reason that there's a process there for the organization. And it, again, education, communications, and you'll still find, you know, the challenge with working with people that, you know, people do things and you sometimes have to go back and repeat the same thing again and again. Hopefully that might help a little bit. Carol says the speaker at BDA referred to data fluency. I think that's a great way of putting it, rather than data literacy. I think that's a much nicer way. I will adopt that. So I think that's a very good way of phrasing it. And I do think it is a real challenge. It's one that's often underlooked and quite hard to work through. Jennifer, regarding centralized versus decentralized approaches, how do you empower users to use Power BI to access their data directly while still keeping a handle on the governance and security and data quality? We're trying to enable a self-service culture, but it feels uncontrolled, and the business users might make ad hoc decisions which undermine. And again, I think these are real risks, and the challenge with the centralized, decentralized is always balancing. And it is always the balancing that one, because some of it comes back to the broader organizational culture around data. And the reality is lots of organizations don't have great maturity with it. And people often talk about data being a pillar of a sort of equivalent around sort of a major asset that's equivalent to sort of estates or your cash, your finance. But people treat often data in a way that they would never consider buildings, really. By and large, people would not consider leaving buildings open with the doors open for anyone to wander in and out, particularly in this day and age of offices, and just to do what anyone can wander in. Or they wouldn't consider sort of leaving details about confidential finance information or piles of money lying around for anyone to pick up. But people often don't think about it in terms of data, and I think it is a challenge. I think that the advantage perhaps of the mixed model, the sort of hybrid model, is trying to curate those centralized data sets that are open to people, where someone centrally has spent the time building out a data set which answers the bulk, a large portion of the questions, but has also aggregated the data or applied the security to the data, can be incredibly helpful in that. So people are consuming a standardized model of data. It's what we others have been trying to do with data warehousing for quite a long period of time, but actually giving people access to data and a curated data model and a semantic layer that means you have a greater visibility and control over those issues is, I think, an incredibly important part of it. And again, education, communication, going back to the people where you identify problems and changing and seeing it as a cultural problem, that people need to treat the data with respect, and that they as a user is liable. I think one of the things a number of organizations have done, which I think I quite like, and it is for the people who want to build out content, to create some gateways for them, and in a lot of organizations it can be as simple as agreeing to some terms and conditions for the use of the license to publish and build reports. And I think that's quite a nice way. Other organizations I know have put in training requirements and all sorts of stuff like that. But as a minimum, if you're going to give someone to publish and share stuff beyond their own individual sort of workspace, then beginning to perhaps think about saying, right, if you do this, you are agreeing, you are adhering to these organizational policies, can be a good starting point for that conversation, I think. But it's a challenge. And I think, interestingly, with the push towards more mesh architectures, becomes even more of a challenge, because not just people in local areas become producing reports off data, they're then becoming responsible for delivering the data for everyone else to work with. So I think these are significant challenges, but I think trying to create that for those core semantic models and working on the communications is a really helpful bit of that I've seen.
And then I think we'll wrap up after this last question.
Okay.
From Cheryl Lee, which was, in the Power BI strategy, should Excel still have a role? We have migrated lots of reports away from Excel into Power BI, yet at the same time, some progress do seem to be more effective using Excel. Power BI, what's the future role in Excel in Power BI?
That's a good question. So while I did read about one organization which banned Excel more or less and made people have to request a specific license in order to install Excel on their computer, I think it's very hard for organizations to do, because it is there. It's a tool which nearly everyone opens and uses, and so it's very hard to put it back in the box. For me, I think it can still have a role as long as you're thinking about it consciously. I think one of the good features with Power BI is particularly where you've built those sort of more controlled, centralized models where people can use analyze in Excel on top of those models and consume exactly the same data items, the dimension, the measures with it. I think is a good role for it, because inevitably users may have questions which the Power BI reports you built won't answer, and you're sort of left in a place there where you either then add a new page to the existing report to answer these new questions, which could be quite niche, or you give the users a bit of empowerment to help answer them themselves. And I think that can work in the right organizational context. Again, everywhere is different. So I think Excel can still have a role. And again, I think when people start to put data in Excel, I think it's easy to see it as a threat or a failure, but I think it also has to be perceived a little bit as an opportunity to ask the question of, you've put the data in Excel, why? What are we still not delivering with Power BI? And also often, is it that the people want to report on some data but don't, if they can connect to it in Excel, often they can, particularly if they're using the Analyze in Excel functionality, they could be building their own Power BI reports off that same central data model, which can be incredibly useful. Of course, there are lots of scenarios where you don't want people to be putting it into Excel, and you don't want to have them exporting data out of your models and stuff like that. And that's a sort of governance and security question. But I think, I suppose I would always say, ask the question of why it's going into Excel, and think about whether analyzing Excel or something like that can help solve those problems. Hopefully I've answered everyone's questions. I suppose I was going to just pick up a couple more things quickly, if that's all right, George. One is, if you do have more questions, you can reach out to me and my colleague Laz at powerbi@datis.co.uk. Please do, drop us an email. We're happy to talk and have an initial conversation. You can also find me and Datis on LinkedIn. So please do reach out to us. We've got a lot of experience of doing this in different scenarios, and what works for one may not work for another, but we've tried a lot of different things, so we do have a lot of experience. And the second thing is, I would urge everyone to come to the next one of these seminars, because my colleague Laz will be digging down into more detail into some of these topics, and particularly one of the things I didn't talk about, but was the role of the Centre of Excellence. And one of their roles is really to champion all of those, lots of the issues people have picked out, Excel, whether we're using it, Power BI, governance, bad behavior. A lot of their role is to be the champions of a better way of doing something, and help support the organization with it. So I think this is definitely one I'd recommend coming to on Thursday, if you're able to, because I think it will be a great session.
Yeah, very much agree. I mean, a lot of the questions asked today, thank you so much for everyone that has asked. The second webinar will just further talk about how to drive the business change using Power BI solutions. There will be an email going out after this webinar, so if you would like to register, the link will be on there. And yeah, thank you so much for everyone to attending. It's been a really great turnout this afternoon. And thank you, Matt, for the fantastic content that you showcased.
My pleasure. Hopefully I'll get to meet some of you in person at some event, some data event somewhere, sort of, rather than being just remotely. But it's been great to speak to you all.
Fantastic
stuff. Do shout at me if you ask me if you've got any other questions. Drop us an email. Find me on LinkedIn. Fantastic stuff.
To everyone, have a lovely rest of your afternoon, and hopefully see some of you guys on Thursday. Excellent.
All right.